Hello and welcome to Reflections in Veterinary Education, or RIVE. For this episode, Catherine is going to be sharing, well, we're all going to talk about it, but Catherine's going to be sharing an article she chose. You want to start, Catherine, by telling us what the article is, the author and title and stuff, and then we'll get.
Sure. Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. I actually had to go look up the title of the article because it didn't print out on my page. But anyway, we're going to talk about an article that was actually sent out by a colleague of mine at NC State. It's from the Chronicle of Higher Education called Do Colleges Value Good Teaching by Beth McMurtry, and this was published in September of 2023. So it's not a typical journal article, but when I read it, I thought there were lots of fun things to have discussions about. So I figured we would talk about it tonight. So I don't know if you all have any specific things that you wanted to focus on, or if you want me to just sort of dive right in. I'm happy to go either way, but there were definitely lots of nuggets in here for me to pick
Oh my
on.
gosh. Yeah, I think it's very far reaching. So
Yeah.
if we could maybe just focus in on veterinary medicine, I think that would be helpful, because otherwise we're going to tackle all the problems of higher education in the next hour.
And what would be
We could do
different than
it.
any other time?
I think we could do it, but yeah, we can stick with the vet med specific.
Yeah. So this actually doesn't focus specifically on veterinary medicine, but it does talk about sort of the broader reaching issues that are concerned with this idea that the general public really values quality teaching in a university, but it's very clear by some of the policies and procedures in higher education that teaching, and good quality teaching in particular, is not actually valued. And that is true both sort of in the sense of from the societal perspective, and sort of this idea that, you know, students sitting in class expect to have good teaching, and but the teachers don't necessarily value that as much, and the teachers who do value that aren't rewarded monetarily or in other ways either. And I think all of those things on a smaller scale in veterinary medicine are also ringing true in many ways, and I don't think that's maybe as true as it used to be. I mean, I like to think with things like, you know, AVE starting up and people really starting to realize that there's value in understanding what good teaching looks like and how you can do it, and some of the science behind it, it's becoming a little bit more widespread. But in general, there's still this very big wall of people who just don't see education as a discipline, as something that's valuable to their careers, and really don't think about it in those terms. So anything that we talk about tonight from this paper, I think we can take the microcosm of veterinary medicine and really apply it in that sense. So I think, let's see. Yeah, so I think even on this first page, I don't know what it's not numbered on mine, but one of the things that struck me from the beginning was this idea that teaching centers are more common than they used to be, according to a new study, but only 26% of higher education institutions even have one. And I thought that was an interesting comment. But I also, from my own dissertation research when I was in doing my PhD, did a bit of a survey of these centers for excellence in teaching and learning, or these centers for teaching excellence, or whatever they are. And it was probably about 15 or 20 that I just sort of Googled to see what the credentials of the individuals who were running those centers had. And the vast majority of those centers for teaching excellence were actually not people who had training in education. And so I found it really interesting that we have this resource on these large campuses where we talk about the value of teaching and the value of education, and yet the people that are running those centers, for the vast majority of them, actually don't have any formal training in education. And so I thought I would throw that meatball out to the both of you to see if that was something that you were familiar with or knew about, or what your take was on that.
You can go first, Eric.
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind for me is, and this is just because it was the first that I became aware of, it was the master teacher program at UT. And that's been going on for a long time now. Like, they had even had a 10-year retrospective article in JVME, you know, within the past few years. And so, you know, I think that when they put that together, I don't actually know, you know, what the credentials of the people involved were at that time. But I guess it's not terribly surprising to me, because I don't know. I have a slight rant about this, but anytime I interact with social scientists, like, they just don't get us. Like, they have no understanding for what clinical medicine and veterinary medicine is, and veterinary medical education is, and all that kind of stuff. So I can just imagine emailing the education department and being like, hey, we want to set up a master teacher program. Can you give us some expertise to help with that? I can imagine that being utterly useless. At least, 10, 15 years ago when we're talking about like these things were starting up. Maybe they've become better now, but that's my experience. Whenever I reach out to social science people, like they just don't give me what I need.
Yeah.
Interesting. I had a different thought. So one, I was a little bit surprised. And then when you just said that, Catherine, and then I thought about it, I'm like, well, I can see that happening sort of naturally for a few reasons. I can imagine a lot of those centers started like a grassroots thing, right? Like, so individuals who are like, I want to be better at my teaching. How do I do this? And so, like, what happens so many times, you don't know what you don't know. And so you just start looking, and maybe you don't necessarily look in the best places because you're sort of teaching yourself, you're figuring this out as you go. And you're like, well, let's just get some like-minded people together. And either they had an experience like Eric is sharing, where it's like they reached out to somebody that they thought would be good and, kind of got rebuffed or just really were disappointed, or they just didn't even know who the people were to reach out to. They didn't even know that, some of these areas where you can, develop expertise in teaching existed, because those programs don't exist at every university. And in veterinary medicine, we're often, kind of tucked away in some corner of the university and not really integrated with main campus, which is largely undergrad, and so I could just see it happening. Now, I don't, for your PhD, Catherine, you were talking about College of Veterinary Medicine, colleges and schools of veterinary medicine and their centers, or just higher education?
Just higher education.
Okay. But again, I can imagine them being sort of grassroots, and started by people who they just felt there was a need. They weren't necessarily experts in saying, hey, we want to spread this amongst, they were like, we need this, so let's just help ourselves. So that's kind of where my head went. I don't know, obviously, if that's how they started, but I can imagine it happening that way.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think what you say is also fair, Eric, because I mean, I think back to the days when I was going through vet school and I actually wanted to do a dual DVM PhD, but I wanted my PhD to be in education. And I think I've told you this story before. And I had my associate dean for academic affairs at the vet school connect me to the associate dean at the College of Ed. And they gave me a handful of, instructors to reach out to say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is my background. And I had a master's in education at that time. And I literally could not get someone from the College of Education to even contact me to have the discussion. It was almost as if there was sort of this reverse prejudice of, you're a veterinarian. What the hell do you need to know about education? And so, and I've heard other people who've had similar experiences, like, an N of 3, but other people who've had similar experiences at different institutions. And so I can see that happening. I think what baffles me the most, and I bring this up because during my dissertation, one of the things that I talked to my participants about was, of where were they getting their teaching and training? And a lot of them talked about these centers for teaching excellence. And it baffles me because, and I think this is a recurring theme that we've had is, if I woke up one day and said, man, I'm going to be a veterinarian and I'm going to go out and I'm going to get all kinds of experience and I'm going to go shadow people and I'm going to just expect them to then teach me in the clinic what I need to know, but I'm not going to go to a formal schooling program. But then I'm going to be able to call myself a veterinarian and go to somebody and say, hey, I've had all this training for 20 years in being a veterinarian. I never went to school for it, but I know how to do everything. Can I get a job? Nobody would even, I would be laughed out of the room, right? And much less call myself an expert in being a veterinarian, right? Like, let's talk
and
about.
Now I'm ready to train others.
Right. Like, let's talk about, I've been working in emergency and critical care for 30 years now. I'm an expert and I never, had formal training, but I can do it. And yet we allow people who teach, the people who become experts in their fields every single day, to call themselves educators or teachers without any formal training. And many times without any informal training. It's totally learned on the job. And so to me, this is sort of it. And that's not to say that the people who are running these centers are doing a bad job. It's just a perpetuation of this idea that anybody can teach and that there's no science behind it and that there's no research behind it and those kinds of things. And so I don't think that's less true in veterinary medicine. I think we still run into that. And I think we're improving that, but I don't think that's less true in veterinary medicine. And in some places it might be even worse, and they talk about that later in the article where they talk about sort of the stonewall of the older generation of instructors who are very insistent that, well, I've been doing this for fill in the blank years, and I think we see that even in the clinics too, right? I know when I was going through school, they were talking about implementing a rubric in the clinical years, and all of the clinical instructors were like, why would you make us do that? We know. I mean, we know when our students are good students and not good students. We've been doing this long enough that we can just work with them we had 2-week rotations, and we know, right? We don't need to have a rubric. So anyway, I think it's interesting. And then the next little sort of nugget that I highlighted in my article was this idea that there's no easily digestible measure of teaching effectiveness. And I think that's one of the challenges, right? When you're talking about teaching effectiveness and when you're talking about quality teaching, what does quality teaching mean? And so I wondered, Bobby, because you have created that FARPET, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that and maybe dive into that a little more.
Yeah. FARPET it's a rubric. So yeah, everybody loves their rubrics, right? But it's for peer evaluation of teaching. And it is, we're trying to, give folks a nice formative. It's meant to be formative. It can sort of be adapted to use summative if people really want it to be, but it's really meant to be a tool to help colleagues give each other feedback on their teaching. And we think it's a pretty robust rubric for that. But what it doesn't do, and we don't purport that it does, but is teaching effectiveness. So, the rubric is built around methods that have been associated with effectiveness. We tried to keep that in mind, but it absolutely doesn't assess effectiveness, which is really it's really hard, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we kind of piece it together. We're like, well, this technique is supposed to be effective. So if I use that a lot, then hopefully overall my teaching is effective. But that's like the thing I care so much about is, are the students really learning what we want them to learn? Are they remembering it long term, which in veterinary medicine in particular is what I care about, right? Not that they pass the test, but are they retaining that, that deep learning and the critical thinking skills that will allow them to build on it? So to be very clear, FARPET does not delve into that, which I think that's the real challenge. I believe. I think things like student evaluations as a piece of overall, assessing teaching, peer evaluation as a piece of, assessing teaching. So the FARPET is, I think, I'm proud of it. I think it's a really good tool, but it's one piece of the puzzle. And it's a very big, complicated, mosaic of a puzzle that, and again, that's for me, the biggest piece that's missing from teaching evaluation is the real effectiveness of, are the students learning what we want them to learn? There are ways to do that. It's very challenging, because I think, especially in veterinary medicine, right? Like if it's not just like, did they pass the test? If it's, what about 3 years from now? What about 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What's the impact that we're having? But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to do it. So yeah, I think peer evaluation of teaching, student evaluation of teaching, and I think there's been a lot written about, what students are very good at assessing when it comes to teaching, like were the instructions clear, was the instructor approachable, which are very important components to teaching. But we also know that students are very much like, we liked this person, or we didn't feel like they made us work too hard, or, we know, and then there's also the biases from the students against women, people of color, particularly women of color. Like we know how problematic student evaluations are. And this is one thing they just touched on briefly in this article about how reliant universities are on student evaluations of teaching for assessing quality teaching. And so I don't think those should be thrown out. I do think there is value in having the student's perspective, but when it's the only perspective, it's a problem. So adding peer evaluation is good, but we need more metrics than just student and peer evaluations, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think none of this is going to happen unless, humans act based on incentives and disincentives, right? So until or unless you build this into an incentive or a disincentive structure, it's not going to change. So if you required everyone to have 2 FARPET evaluations every year to get a favorable yearly evaluation, then it would happen.
Yep.
Right. And until and unless that happens, it's not going to. Like, just asking people to opt in is not going to get the kind of change that we need systemically, because it's a system, right? You need to change the system. The people will follow.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's bugged me for years. We had this plan at Georgia to require, peer observation. We came up with it, and I had this whole structure, and then it fell apart because there was no enforcement.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no requirement. I'm like, well, what the hell do we do all that work for?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the other issue too, is that there's a lot of in academia this idea that I don't have enough time, right? So the clinicians don't have enough time, the administrators don't have enough time, the people who are supposed to be managing, the department heads don't have enough time. And I'm not here to say that that's not the case, but I think
I'll say it.
But I
I'll
do
say
think
it. I see people sitting around all the time. I
No, I
sit
mean,
around,
I
and
think that's true.
I know how much I sit around, and I publish
Yeah.
10 papers a year. So I can
Yeah.
only imagine what other people are doing.
Fair point. And I would say in many ways though, and I actually agree with you, Eric. This is a whole separate conversation that I've had with many of my colleagues about, like, people in academia often think that they're busy, but they don't really understand busy because many of them have never been outside of academia to know what really busy is, but it's maybe a different kind of busy. But what I would also say is that it's a cop-out, right? Because it means that if I say that I'm too busy, it means that I'm also saying that this isn't a priority for me.
That's exactly what it means.
If you want to make it a priority, then you will figure out something that you can either take off your plate or find a way to fit it into the schedule that you have so that it's important enough that other people also think that it's important, right? So
yeah, 100%.
Right? Like, the world is not going to end if you shut down the hospital for an hour, or if you require somebody to do a half an hour, even a half an hour observation with feedback. The world is not going to end. And I think we're so, as a profession, especially in academia, in this idea of like, we can't have the hospital understaffed. You can still staff the hospital, right?
It's not just that. So I think it goes even further. And I think this was touched on in the article as well. So for example, we have adopted in our department at Virginia Tech at the college, the FARPET for the small animal department. And then the large animal department adopted that. And then another department wanted to adopt it and then was told in no uncertain terms that this isn't going to help my people get promoted and it's a lot of work. And so we're not doing it.
Yeah.
That's not a thing. Like, so there were people on the department who were like, we think this is really good and it's going to benefit us. And it's going to help our teaching, which is like, I love that. That's wonderful. Yeah. But they were basically told from the top down, we're not doing this because it's too much time and effort and work. And this is not how people get promoted.
Right.
And while that's a frustrating response for me, it's not wrong.
Right.
Because that's how people get promoted. And so that gets back to Eric's point that until this becomes actually, again, this is the incentives, part of things. And I will say, I think you're right, Catherine, that things are improving. And I personally I've seen benefits to my career by focusing on my teaching and educating myself and developing that. Like, I have been able to get promoted. I've been, I think, pretty successful in developing that and being supported in doing that. However, at the end of the day, this came up in the article as well. You have tenured and what's the term she used in the article? It wasn't conditional, but there was a term she used. Contingent.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've never thought of myself as a contingent faculty member, but I am because I'm not tenured. I've never felt like insecure in my job that I was like, I'm not going to get renewed, but it's not the same as tenure and it's not valued in the same way. And so to me, that's also emblematic of the difference in the value system between tenure and non-tenure. There's just.
And it's kind of the big lie too, right? Like, everybody wants to say, so at my first institution, when I was choosing whether to take a tenure track position or a non-tenure track position, it was like, well, it doesn't really matter, right? Tenure or non-tenure doesn't really matter, but we all know that it does, right? It's that hidden curriculum. And so fast forward at that first institution, 8 years later, after I'd put in my time and I'd been promoted and I was getting ready to take another job and they wanted to keep me there. And the other job was a really good raise for me. And I went in to talk to my dean and I was like, listen, I really want to stay here, but I have this amazing job offer that's going to pay me X amount of money. And he looked at me and he was like, he flat out said it to me. He was like, I can't match that. If you are tenure track, then I could match it, but you're non-tenure track. So the best I can do is, it was $20,000 to $25,000 less. And this is from the same man who's going around telling people tenure doesn't matter. But clearly when push came to shove, tenure mattered. And the thing that is so frustrating about that from the perspective of someone who, I still do research. I've still published 20 publications over the course of my career, which that doesn't sound like a lot, but for qualitative research isn't too bad. I've got, a textbook coming out. I've been invited to write things. It's not like I'm not doing the research, but the fact of the matter is that research doesn't matter because it's not bringing millions of dollars into the university. Yeah. It's not bringing prestige. It's not speaking to the, innovative advances in science or whatever, math or whatever. But it is speaking to innovative advances in education. It is speaking to the importance of high quality teaching in the classroom. It is speaking to the fact that I have figured out a way to help my students learn and retain material, which is at the heart of every higher education institution.
Only reason these institutions exist.
Right, should be what's valued far more than all the money that comes in. But that's a whole... But they definitely touched on that.
But the funny thing about the money, right? We always come back to the money and the grants and the money that, the big research dollars that come in. But can we go back for a second and start doing the math on tuition?
Yeah.
Can we start looking at those dollars and say, like, what are those for? Because I'm pretty sure there's a lot of money tied up in tuition, which is students who are paying for an education. So to say that that is like bothers me a lot is that we talk about research dollars. I'm like, no, tuition dollars. Can we start just calling that out? And I'd like to see those numbers because that's who's paying my salary. You might have an NIH grant. And good for you. Like, I'm not trying to say it shouldn't be a competition, right? Like all of these things can be valuable. It doesn't have to be but we say, oh, well, they're bringing on all this money. Wonderful. So am I, right?
And we have a much steadier stream of that money. We have a much more...
not going to end up in 3 years, right? But if we don't do a good job teaching, then we are going to see that money dry up. And so
or will we, right? Like, that's the thing that higher education, I think this was brought up in the article, has had an iron lock on careers for so long. But you know what? Now there's Khan Academy, there's YouTube. You no longer need to get a university degree to get fairly competent at a wide range of things.
Yeah.
And something that you touched on was the prestige piece, and that also factors into the money thing. And when I was reading this article, I was like, there is a school of veterinary medicine that is consistently ranked in the top 3, where I know for a fact that the third-year residents teach the clinical students, they don't have clinical interns, and it's a crappy student experience.
Yeah.
How in God's name are they consistently ranked so high? It's because their research and their reputation and all that nonsense. Everyone knows the teaching is rubbish.
Right.
Everyone in veterinary medicine knows it. So how did that happen?
Applying, no, and that's the part that I think it was touched on in the article, but didn't really answer the question is, you might be asking those questions and you might be touring this institution and nobody's like, we've got all these researchers and our teaching is crap. Like, that's not what's being told to the students.
No, what they tell the students is that we're number 3, right? They don't say what goes into number 3 is self-evaluations, evaluations from alumni, evaluations from people who currently work there. It's such a stacked system, right? It's ridiculous. But I think the other thing is going back to that priority, right? That idea that we bring in a steady stream of students. And yes, there's Khan Academy, there's YouTube, there's all these things. But what we bring is we bring the personal element. And that's decreasing, unfortunately, as students are discovering that they don't have to be in class. But research is very consistent that students, especially adult students who attend class, tend to learn more and retain more, which it seems common sense to me, but apparently is not common sense. But I will say just recently, I had an experience with a faculty member whose priority was not teaching, it was attending a meeting. And to me, it's like that is sort of in a nutshell, the epitome of what's going on, right? Like, I had to remind this individual that the first priority and our first obligation in our program is to our students. And so if you really feel like going to this meeting that happens every week is more important than teaching your students and missing that meeting 1 week, then you are welcome to find somebody else who will deliver that content. But the fact that I even had to give that option to somebody is astounding to me, because my first priority is to my students, to our students. Like, that is in my head, but that is clearly not the case for, I can't say a majority, but a lot of faculty who have other obligations that they feel are more important, right?
and there's, there's the classroom, there's all the things we're doing, but like in the clinic as well. So, one thing the way I look at it and the way I talk about it is that in the clinic, I have two clients, right? I have the pet owner and I have the student, and they, in my mind, they are equally important, right? Like the teaching, but they're also, I can do these at the same time. We have the same goal, right? My goal is to teach the students how to provide excellent clinical care. And by providing excellent clinical care, that's a great way to do that. So, so they're not at odds, right? But I do have I have two clients that I'm serving here. And I think we forget that a lot. And, in the heat of the moment, sometimes, in any given moment, the priorities shift slightly, but overall, right, that is the priority. I'm not going to stop CPR to be like, all right, let's go through that. But I'm, for stable things, I'm going to be like, this can wait a little bit while I talk through this with this student, right? So, they're sharing my time and my expertise. And I think that gets lost sometimes as well.
For sure.
Anyhow.
So there's this section in there that talks about why is teaching so undervalued in higher education. And one of the quotes in there is, no one is making the argument that people are born researchers, but there's always this argument out there, oh, you're just a born teacher, right? And so this is kind of going back to that whole training and priorities thing, but I just wanted to know your guys' thoughts on that, because I think there is that sort of pervasive attitude, but when you put it in those stark terms, to me, it was like, that's brilliant, but I don't know how you guys felt about that.
Until I did my master's in education, I probably held to that belief as well, because I'd been teaching in some semi-formal capacity since I was like 12 years old. And so I believed that I had some competency in teaching. And, there is something to be said for practicing a thing and getting better at it. But without getting necessarily feedback or mentoring or anything like that, there's only so far you can progress, and then once I started doing my master's in it, it presented all these formal concepts. I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. Why didn't they tell me this 20 years ago? Like that would have just made this whole progression way faster and stronger and better for me. So I definitely was one of those people that felt like, oh yeah, I'm like a naturally competent teacher. And I think I was probably like competent, maybe not incompetent, but certainly not as good as I could have been.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting because there is a lot that you can learn through trial and error, right? I mean, there's a lot that I've learned over trial. So like Eric said, I had the same experience, like, man, I would have skipped so many years of like bad thing, like just, mediocre teaching or, assignments that were just not beneficial. So I definitely would have skipped ahead a lot. But I think a lot of this comes back to, and sort of ties into the student evaluation of teaching, right? A charismatic teacher or somebody who is funny and this is also important as well, who cares, right? Like the students perceive that. And while that is an important component of good teaching, it's not the entirety of good teaching. And so I think there's been this conflation of, charismatic teachers who work hard and try at it, right? And some trial and error so that maybe they get better over the years. But that, like you said, that's not quite the same. And that also doesn't mean you're just naturally a good teacher. You might have an interest in it. And if you have an interest and you work at it, you're probably going to be better. Or if you have these other qualities that are sort of believed to be, or you're liked, right? You're a popular teacher. That doesn't necessarily mean you're an effective teacher. It doesn't mean you're not, but they're not necessarily.
They're not one and the same.
Yeah. And so again, I think for years, an over-reliance on student evaluation. So popularity, you're like, yeah, this is a good teacher. Oh, they're just naturally good. Well, that person probably has some qualities that make them naturally appealing to students, but that doesn't mean they're a good teacher. So I
also wonder how ubiquitous teaching is in our culture contributes to that. Like nobody is like, oh yeah, you're a good veterinarian, just like walking around watching this person. But how many people think that they're good drivers?
True.
Well, I'm pretty sure more than 50% of drivers think they're above average drivers.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
So it might just be because a lot of us do teaching as part of our everyday tasks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think and that's probably a whole other philosophical conversation, is there is a difference between teaching someone and educating somebody in my mind, right? So teaching is maybe task oriented or just trying to impart a small piece of information to someone that they might eventually grasp and use. Whereas to me, educating is sort of a holistic way of approaching what you're doing and helping somebody learn in a profession, right? How holistically, we're not teaching students how to become veterinarians. In my mind, we're educating them that it's not just about the knowledge, it's also about the clinical skills, it's the communication skills, it's the sort of professionalism and the way that you're going to interact with people and present yourself and carry yourself and the things that you can and can't say and all those kinds of things. And so I think oftentimes we don't get granular enough when we're talking about the discipline itself anyway, and saying, you know, well, yeah, maybe we all are teachers, but maybe not all educators. And sort of that's how I sort of separate that in my head. And I think along those lines, and, you know, focusing specifically on veterinary education, this line talking about many higher ed leaders don't come from teaching backgrounds. And I think that's really important to remember. And that's very true in veterinary medicine as well, right? And specifically, I'm thinking about the position of academic affairs, right? Academic dean. And so many, at least in my experience in veterinary medicine, and again, I think this is starting to change a little bit, but academic affairs was sort of where, for lack of a better phrase, the old white guy who is like not doing well in anything else, but was tenured and didn't want to retire, was sort of dumped into academic affairs, because it was like, well, we can't get rid of them because they're tenured. They don't really do the job they're supposed to do. We'll just put them in academic affairs. They can't screw things up too much, right? And that's an oversimplification. And I'm sure there are going to be people who listen to this that are going to be outraged, but that's been my experience in veterinary medicine. And I think that is, again, I do think that is changing, but I think that's a big problem when you put people into leadership roles, specifically in academic dean roles, right? And I don't know that this is true outside of veterinary medicine, but at least within veterinary medicine, who don't know enough about education and or don't care enough about education to really do the hard work it takes to sort of improve the situation. So that was sort of my response to that section. I don't know if you all have other comments or other responses to it.
I think this is the same section where they were talking about the student support services and like the way that the finances have changed. Like there's less money going towards instruction per se and more towards student support and mental health and all that sort of thing. And I don't know that I'd reflected on that before. I think it's interesting to think about that and decide, you know, where is the balance there? Obviously, if students are stressed, they're not going to be good learners. But if we are taking those resources away from instructional activities, maybe that's not the best balance. Not sure.
But on the flip side of that, are we, and I had written this in my notes actually, is if we invested that money that we're putting into student services side into teaching people how to be better teachers, would our students then be less stressed?
Yeah.
I would argue if you're going to invest that money in me, it is going to make them way more stressed.
Take note.
But you know, the students' NAVLE scores in my system were previously below the national average, and then the year I taught them, it was 4 points above the national average. So I mean, they were stressed and they were unhappy, but they freaking learned something.
Right.
Well, and there's evidence out there for that, right? So this was, I'm going to flub. I don't remember it. Years ago, I read this article and it was comparing student evaluations of teaching to outcomes. And so this took place somewhere in Europe. I can't remember exactly where the details were, but it was these large undergrad courses where they had two different sections of the same course. And so two different instructors, and this course was a prerequisite for a later course where there was one section. And so they basically looked at the performance of students in the later section, and how they performed, and they compared that to which section they were in the prerequisite course, and compared that to the student evaluations of teaching. And the class that was, they talked about in the article, was like an easier course, got much higher ratings by the students. But the students who were in the less favored course performed better later, like on average. Like what a great, natural sort of experiment that they could do, and to be able to kind of document that the more popular teacher was not, in this case, associated with better learning. Now, that's obviously not always going to be true, but it was just basically, we need to separate out the student evaluations from outcomes. Like we need to understand that those are not predicting what the students are learning. And so, Eric.
And to extend that, I would argue that maybe, I'm not saying that we need to stress students out, but this has been coming up a lot for us lately, where it's like, what are you going to do when a client asks you a question that you don't know? You
Yeah.
know, like, what are you going to do when there's an emergency that you have to take care of? Like, what are you going to do when you're in these real life situations if you've been coddled all throughout your educational
Yes.
career? Yeah,
We know
what are
we
you
need
going
to
to do?
stress them some, right? We have to stress them
Yeah.
and
Right.
challenge them enough so that they learn, because that's
Challenge
what thing
them.
happens, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's we got to get them in that right zone, right? Not too far. What is the zone of proximal development? Is that?
Development. Yeah.
And so we need to get them in that zone, not too far, not like that. We do need to stress them. We don't want to overstress them. We don't want to overwhelm them, but we do have to challenge them. And I will say, I find, especially when you get into vet med, like the students are fine being challenged. Like they want to be
Yes.
challenged as long as they're seeing that there's a benefit to it and it doesn't feel like busy work. I think most of them, you're going to have some people complaining, right?
I
But most of them are actually, I found pretty good with being challenged.
Yeah, and I think they want to be reasonably challenged. And I
Yeah.
think when I say if we poured those resources into teaching our veterinary instructors how to be better teachers, that they would see that what they're doing right now is vastly unreasonable, right? So when I'm having a conversation with somebody who tells me, well, I mean, what am I supposed to do? I have 50 minutes and I have to get through 122 slides. And I look at them and I say, no, you don't have to get through
In fact,
122
you
slides.
can't.
In fact, what you need to do is you should never have more than 25, maybe 30, but ideally 25 slides for a 50-minute session. And you should make sure that that information is information they need to know, right? Because if you're giving them and then the response is, but I mean, a lot of them are pictures, so I'm not spending much time on them. And I'm like, well, then you don't need the
Not
pictures,
fair.
or you need to only have pictures and you need to spend more time on them, right? Because those are the things that are going to help your students learn. And so that's what I say is, if you invest in teaching teachers what's important and telling them, listen, we're not here to make experts out of our first year veterinary students. We're here to give them enough so that they're challenged, so that they understand the applicability of the topic that you're teaching them to what they want to do in their lives, and they can learn the language of medicine. That's what we need them to do, right? We don't need them all to be anatomists or
Well, and
microbiologists.
memorizing 122 slides worth of facts does not make an expert.
No, it does.
Like,
And that's exactly what they're doing, is they're memorizing it. They're not learning it. They're not
yeah.
digesting it and absorbing it in a way that makes any sense. And so I think I've been on both sides of that, where, when I was teaching very regularly in the public health program, my students knew they were going to be challenged and they knew it was going to be a hard class, and they hated my class for the first 3 weeks, because when I asked them a question, I expected them to talk. I expected them to engage in the material. And then they realized, A, this was way more fun, right? Because we're not just sitting there listening to her drone on and on. But B, I actually retained the material. I mean, I've had students email me 5 years after they graduated and say, I just want you to know I hated environmental health when I went into public health. I'd never done anything environmental health that I liked. I still hate environmental health. But on my CPH exam, I scored higher in environmental health than any other section on the exam because of your class. And it's not because the class was easy, right? I mean, I had standards, and they knew that
Learning isn't easy.
right.
Like,
And so I think that you can be likable. I think that you can be engaging. I think that you can be a positive, really good teacher, and also challenge them in a way that demonstrates that, hey, I have expectations for you. I know you can meet them. I'm going to give you the tools to do that.
too.
And
Yeah.
that's where we want everybody to be. And so that's where my comment comes, Eric, because I actually doubt very seriously that your students would be more stressed, because I get the sense from you that you're the kind of person who understands that, right? Like, you're not trying to turn all of your students into anesthesiologists or cardiologists or whatever. You're just trying to give them enough information, and maybe a little bit more, to get them interested, but also understand the value of having the basic information when they get out into practice. And that's really what it comes down to, right? And it involves a little bit of stress. And I think we've also, as undergraduate institutions feeding us, I struggle with this too, because our students have been taught to view learning in a way that is maybe not ideal as well.
Sure. Or just the lack of being taught anything and they just come up with their own ideas. But I wanted to circle back to something you asked earlier, Catherine, about the leadership, the academic leadership, and sort of how those roles came about, and how hopefully things are changing. But 12 years ago now, I was thinking, like, where do I see myself? And I was really starting to get into the education side of things, and really was, I really like that. That's been my passion. That's why I'm here now. and I approached everybody has a different title, but our equivalent of Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, and just kind of reached out to her at the time and said, hey, like if in 15, 20 years, and I'm kind of done doing overnights and weekends and holidays, and I wanted to transition. I want to stay in vet med and I want to stay in academia. How I can't see myself like being a department head or a hospital, like none of that appeals to me. And so, what should I do now to kind of prepare myself for that kind of a role? And was super supportive, very nice, but didn't give me any advice at the time about like become an educator. You know what I mean? Like get some training, do a master's. Like that didn't come up at all. It was like, okay, you should join these types of committees and try to get experience on these types of things. And it was that's how I got the job, right? That I just, I showed an interest in education. And so I just did these things and I taught some courses and, made that a priority. But it wasn't like, oh, well, because you don't know what you don't know. And the advice was not, hey, maybe you should consider getting a master's or a PhD in education, or you should try to do this continuing education. So now I was fortunate that I got into the right circles and I had somebody else give me that advice later. And it was like, oh, I guess I could do that. Yeah. I probably should have come up with that on my own and I didn't. But yeah, so like 10, 12 years ago, that didn't come up in the advice. If you want to become an associate dean for academic affairs, yeah, just, join the curriculum committee. And, hope I mean, it was obviously more than that, but yeah, there was definitely no recommendation to get specific education training.
Yeah.
And I think that is changing. And again, that has changed. I had gotten different advice later, but it's not widespread. It's not universal, I guess, is what I would say. So it's nice to see that it's changing, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely I appreciate that story because I definitely think that's the case. And I am seeing more and more academic deans that have some education training, maybe not a terminal degree, but they at least have a certificate or they have a master's degree or they've done something that has prepared them to understand that. But there are still a good number of senior leaders within veterinary medicine who do not have that training, that are doing a lot of the driving in some cases of some of the movements that are going on. And I find myself on the side of fundamentally disagreeing with some of that and, having to struggle with, okay, how do I sort of navigate the political aspects of that? And I think that's another thing that we don't necessarily talk about, that they do talk about in the article, is the politics of higher education, right? And how that changes.
Can I stir up a hornet's nest?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I would love to know both of your opinion on like the AVMA for accreditation for veterinary schools requires a lot of these high positions, like to be a hospital director or the associate dean for academic affairs or the dean of the veterinary school. You have to have a DVM or an equivalent, right? Thoughts?
I was having that same thought, and I was trying to think of the deans that I have worked with, and almost all of them have come from a research background. Yeah. I would say more than 50% come from the research track. A handful have been clinicians, and I think one was an associate dean of students. Yeah. And I think that is almost more of an obstacle than the associate dean of students not having formal education in education, because the buck stops at the dean a lot of the time, in my experience. And if they don't understand some of these pretty important educational concepts, or they don't have the background to even frame the conversation in a useful way, that is a real stumbling block.
Yep.
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts on that. I do think it's important that a DVM be a dean, right? Like, I think to be a dean of a veterinary program, you need to be a veterinarian. Just like if you're going to be the dean of a medical school, you need to be a physician, or a nursing school, you need to be a nurse, because you have to understand the discipline in a way that somebody from the outside doesn't. That said, I don't necessarily think that to be an academic dean, you need to be a veterinarian or a nurse or a physician. And there are a couple of academic deans in veterinary medicine that are not, and they are PhDs in education. And I think they do an amazing job. I do think it's a more difficult road for them, because they have to sort of figure out the system and figure out the discipline in a way that other people already sort of have because they're veterinarians. So I think it might depend on how willing that individual without the veterinary background is and how able they are to come into a program like veterinary medicine and sort of understand what their limitations and understanding the curriculum is, and B, know from the educational perspective the types of things that they can take from education that apply broadly regardless of what type of discipline you're in, but then leave sort of the details and weeds to other people and have a good core group of people that can advise them in that way. I would love to see deans of veterinary colleges have training in education, because I think that would be really helpful, right? That might just depend on the individual institution. Certainly some institutions, deans are much more involved in fundraising and the political side of it, and others, they're a little bit more involved in the, curriculum and education side. But yeah, I think I agree that the dean needs to be a veterinarian, but do I think they need some additional training? Probably. And that's probably true if I think about my deans, they've all been come from that more research background as well.
It's funny. So I'm not entirely sure. I do think they need to have a DVM. And this stems a little bit from previously. So when I was at Florida, we lost our dean fairly abruptly. And we had an interim dean who was from the faculty of the veterinary school, but was one of our research faculty who had been there for like 25 years, was phenomenal. And I was like, this guy's, yeah, he's gonna apply to be the dean. And then I found out later that like I didn't realize that was a requirement. And I was like, but this person knows this, so do they need to have an intimate understanding of, the profession? Yes, but I think that people could, without being a veterinarian, like I think you could, and you could have the other skills that maybe another person wouldn't have. So I don't know the right answer.
Yeah.
I'm not here. Obviously it's great job security if it's only DVMs that can have these things. But I think I wonder if we are cutting ourselves off to potentially really amazing people who could be in those roles. And then we just say, nope, we're just not going to even consider that. So what if you had a physician who had been doing, all this stuff for a long time, was like, oh, I'm going to come to, vet school. And I've had experience with this. How hard would it be? There are obviously differences between human and veterinary medicine. I don't mean that, but like, could they learn the difference? I think they could. So I just, I'm just trying to be a little provocative, but I'm not convinced that in order to be a dean or an associate dean, that you necessarily have to be a DVM. But
No, I don't think at the associate dean level, you necessarily have to be a DVM. I think it does help in some ways. And I think until the credibility issue is resolved and we can all accept that no matter where you come from, you're capable, if you're hired into that position, then that might be different. But I do think currently, at least in the current environment, you're just not going to have the same credibility if you come into a leadership role and you don't have the same kind of training.
Which is a little bit crazy to me that you could be like in these higher level, but you're not practicing as a veterinarian, right? And so you might miss out on people who have actually a better skill set for that job.
Agreed.
So anyway, like I'm
that's
choosing between a DVM and somebody with a PhD in education. If those are my choices, right? Obviously I want both, but if those are my choices to have somebody lead an academic institution, maybe
and
submitted the job that it is.
Submitted for consideration. Does knowing more about education make one's job as an associate dean way more freaking frustrating without giving you any ability to affect the outcome?
I mean, from my experience, I can say absolutely. I mean, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not super frustrated because somebody wants to tell me how to do something. And I'm like, no, right? Like I would never go to Bobby and tell Bobby how to manage an emergency critical care case because Bobby is a board certified like specialist in emergency critical care. I would never come to you and tell you, well, no, I really think that you need to use this anesthesia protocol because you're like the expert. But people don't have any problems telling me what they think when I have 2 degrees in education, one of them terminal, and I don't know everything about education. It's not possible for me to know, but there are things that I do know about. And they're telling me, oh, no, you need to do it this way. And I'm like, no, actually, here's the research that says I'm doing it the way it's supposed to be done. And so 100% have lots of frustration with that.
Yeah.
But that's probably just me. I don't know.
Yeah, that's probably me being an idealist. Like I'm imagining somebody in that position who's not a veterinarian, but is an expert in education, but they're surrounded by veterinarians, right? Like other people
Sure.
who could say, oh, here's that perspective. This is why this needs to happen in this way. And you go, oh, that makes sense. Okay, here's how do we adapt to this environment.
Yeah.
So yeah, it does
I think
involve
that,
a lot more working together.
that definitely gets to like, how do you affect change? And I think
Thank
that a lot of traditional universities are still faculty led. And
Mhm.
so as long as that's
Yeah.
the case, administration has a very limited ability to impact things, I think.
Well, and I think there is a misperception about that, right? Like, so Bobby and I are working on a curriculum review task force, and we have this meeting of 2 or 3 representatives from every department because we want to get buy-in from the faculty, which is really important and all those kinds of things. But we sort of had an early conversation where we were talking about an email that was supposed to come out. And one of the people on the committee was like, well, I really think this email needs to come from somebody that has a lot of authority. So I'm looking at you, Catherine, and I'm like,
Catherine's like, I have
you
no
are like 100% mistaken about how much authority I have. Like, I need to help you understand. Lots of responsibility, very little authority.
I'm pretty sure that's exactly what you said too. You kind of chuckled and you were like, oh, I have all the responsibility and none of the authority.
100%. Right.
Really
and so, funny. Yeah. And I think that's, so that and as we're getting ready to wrap up here, that speaks to this last paragraph of this idea that many of the workers they talk about in this article, right, particularly the contingent workers or those faculty that, aren't necessarily guaranteed positions from year to year, they have no authority to change anything. So even if they want to do something within a classroom or they want to do something on a bigger level, they don't know how to do it. And I do think there are grassroots opportunities to affect change, as Bobby has alluded to. And I think that's really where it comes down. I mean, I know even as a junior, as an adjunct faculty member at my first institution, I would be teaching and people would come by the hall and they give me these looks of like, they're glaring at me because my students are giggling and having fun in class and it was a little bit loud. And they're like, why do you have so much chaos going in your classroom? How do you know what's going on? I'm like, I know what's going on. They're learning, right? Like, and they're doing exactly what I hope they would do. And so as students would go talk about that, there were occasionally other faculty who would come to me and be like, well, how do you set this up? Why are you doing it this way? And we have those conversations and then they would pick that up. But from like a top down type of situation, I still had to deal with a dean who would email things and say, well, I noticed that you are, you awarded more than the average faculty member in A's. And so if this happens again, then we're going to have to sit down and have a discussion about this because you should be having a bell curve of grades within your class. And I'm like, no, actually, that's not what good educational research indicates. And it's like, we need to be moving that curve, like skewing it to the left, right? Ideally, if we're doing our jobs, every student's going to earn an A, right? Like that's what we're supposed to be doing. So yeah, I don't know how you all feel because you have different areas of responsibility and I know, Eric, you've had different levels of leadership in your career as well. So
I mean, there's things that the department head has within their power. Absolutely. Sure. The department head could give an edict. This is what's going to be. This is how it's going to be. This is what your raise is going to be based on. Mm-hmm. And I did that, and people that didn't do the thing didn't get the raise they were expecting. And it's like, well, you got to do the thing. So the department head does have some power and authority in that regard. And then the P&T guidelines, like the faculty just need to redraft them. That's each department's faculty can meet and decide what the rules are that they want for their department. And historically it has been research heavy. And part of the problem with that is the difficulty in measuring teaching, which we've touched on a lot. And so it's like, if you're going to require that, what is that going to look like,
Yeah, I guess my other beef with P&T committees is it's slowly changing now, but who sits on P&T committees?
Right, tenured research.
It's T. It's all T. Like, and it's amazing because somebody who's tenure track, there's no problem with a tenured or tenure track professor reviewing a non-tenure track faculty member. But we definitely are going to have a subcommittee if we want to have non-tenure folks. Like, we can't have non-tenured people reviewing the tenured.
Pretty amazingly, we actually do here.
Do you? Good for you. That's awesome.
That's great.
I love that. Because that's one of the issues that I have. And the last thing I'll say to your point, Catherine, is yes, grassroots is awesome. However, it can be exhausting, right?
Yes.
If you're doing all this work and you're like, man, I'm so excited about this. And I've been very fortunate that I've been supported in those efforts across the board, both from like department heads, from colleagues, and in the promotion process, but not everybody is.
Right.
And if you are trying to improve your teaching and you're putting all this time and effort into it, and then you're not seeing any returns, you're not getting that feedback, you're not getting the promotion, you're not getting a raise, you're just not even getting a like, hey, that's great, we like that you're doing that, keep doing it. Eventually you're going to say, I got to stop doing this because I have to devote time to these other parts of my job that are going to count.
Yeah.
And that's the harsh reality of it. And it's really unfair. And again, I do think things are changing. Personally, I've benefited from those changes, and we need to keep pushing. But we need to recognize that, yeah, people don't have, endless capability to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing if you're a contingent faculty member in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we probably need to talk on another episode about the tensions between the varying leader roles within the College of Veterinary Medicine, because I think the dean and the administrative suite that falls under them, as long as like the associate dean for research, the associate dean for academic affairs, and if there's any other associate deans, but then the department heads, right? There's a different power structure there, and it's an unusual situation, I think. So that
And then if you have a teaching hospital, a hospital director,
hospital director,
that's another
where do they fall
complication.
in? Yeah, so I think that might be an interesting conversation for another section. But
good. Maybe we can figure out who my boss is. That'd be cool.
Yeah, that'd be great, right? So yeah, so anyway, thanks for reading this a little bit non-traditional article, but I read it and I thought it was really interesting and touched on a lot of things that I think we've had some intermittent conversations about. So I don't know if you all have any last comments about it, but hopefully you enjoyed it at least.
Oh, it was great. It was good to change it up a little.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Good chatting as always. We'll catch you all next time.